3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to our first A Day in the Life lunchtime interviews. I'm Melissa Brown. I'm the Family Violence Training Coordinator for the Bayside Peninsula Integrated Family Violence Partnership. And I'm here with Lewi, who is a men's behaviour change program organiser and facilitator. Before we get started today, I thought I might just open up with an acknowledgement. I am honoured to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this interview is taking place. I pay respects to elders, past, present, future and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal community members that might be watching. I acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonisation for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, families and communities. I express my hope for reconciliation. I acknowledge that sovereignty of the land which we are doing this today was never ceded. This land is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you, Bev, for doing this. Greatly appreciate your volunteering, and I'd like to welcome you for our viewers to be getting some insight about what you do and how you do it and all those things. So I guess first off, tell us about where you do your job and a little bit about the role.
Absolutely. Thank you, firstly, for the opportunity, because as you know, I can talk about this topic underwater because it is a real passion of mine. So my role currently is to provide training for the Bayside Peninsula in a variety of areas, but I also do men's behaviour change program facilitation. So I'm not doing that currently, but I have done it for a number of agencies over the last number of years now as well. So it's certainly an area that I intend to stay involved in and hopefully we'll be getting back to very soon.
Fantastic. So how long had you been doing that role, and how did you get involved in doing that role?
So I had an extensive career in education in a number of different roles, and then later in life requalified with a Master of Social Work and started work as a family support practitioner, being very green at the time and wanting to naturally come in and save the world, as you do as an eager social worker. And so in the role of a family support practitioner, most of my work was dealing with the primary carer of children. That could be the mother, the father, grandparents, kinship placements, whatever. And it was largely around providing parenting support. So that was kind of the umbrella. But as you'd be aware, or anyone in the sector would be aware, it's never quite that simple and straightforward. And there were always other factors that were impacting on a parent's capacity to be able to parent. And mainly with women, mothers, the work I was doing with them, there would almost always be a level of what I call domestic abuse. So I don't use, as you'd well know, the term family violence, because I think that leads people to think of the very physical nature of abuse, which is certainly tragic and horrific. But again, for anybody working in this field, we're all too aware of the other forms of abuse that largely women and children experience, and how damaging and devastating that can be for them as a person, and certainly in the field I was working in at the time, for their capacity to parent in the way that they wanted to and in the way that they knew that they should be, or they felt they should be, but that was being impinged, and it was being impinged on by the abuse they were experiencing. So virtually every client I had as a family support practitioner had or was experiencing domestic abuse, either historically or currently. So within the role, I would try and support them as best as possible on that journey. So on a recognition of what they had experienced. Virtually every woman, mother I came across took on some, if not a large part of the responsibility for the abuse. So it was having some gentle conversations around the abuse sits with the person perpetrating the abuse, not with you or your behaviours. And for some women, that in and of itself was an awakening that they'd never even thought about before. Doing work around the cycle of violence. Again, for some women, it was like, wow, you've just been a fly on my lounge room wall, because that's exactly what I experienced. For other women, it was, no, that's not my experience. There's just this constant level of tension, that walking on eggshells that might go up and down a bit, but there's no honeymoon, there's no remorse, etc. But so doing a lot of work with them around that, linking them into services that might be appropriate, applying for brokerage where possible. So there was a lot of work I was doing with them, or say with the schools, in trying to support schools to understand that mum's not a bad parent because she doesn't get the children to school on time. She's actually amazing, given what she'd experienced the night before or that morning. The fact that she's even managed to get the kids to school in uniform with lunches, albeit 20 minutes late. So having some of those conversations as well. But within all that work that I would do with the parent and the victim survivor specifically, it always felt like a bit of a band-aid, and that something was missing, because you would try and support them to the best of your ability, but it just didn't feel like you were getting to the root of the issue, which by and large was their current or former partner, the abuse they were experiencing from them. So that kind of took a little bit of a while to percolate. And as I said, I was very green to start off with, and it was all a process and a journey for myself. But I then observed a couple of men's behaviour change programs and kind of went, that's it. That's where the work is, and that's what we need to be addressing. So I did the necessary studying and accreditation to become a men's behaviour change program facilitator. And that was probably around 6 years ago now or so. And I've been working on and off in that area since then for a number of different agencies and with a number of different facilitators as well.
Okay. How long, oh, sorry, how do the clients or how do the men come into the program?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because even in the sort of 6 or 7 years that I've been doing this, the nature of the groups have changed a bit. So at the beginning, there were a lot of mandated, court mandated or child protection mandated participants, but you would have a handful of what you'd call voluntary participants as well. And that's become less apparent. So there do seem to be far more court mandated men. Now, when I say a number of the men were voluntary, they were kind of almost mandated, because often it would be their partner saying to them, if you don't address this and if you don't try and get help, we're done. So they were almost mandated by their partners. So there are very few men, in my experience, who've come into the group who come in with a ready acknowledgement and willingness that their behaviour is their choice. And their behaviour is what is problematic and having a negative impact on their relationships and on their children's lives. And again, that's another journey that you try and lead the participants on to gain some of that understanding.
Right. When they are mandated, are they, I guess, reviewed beforehand? Are they just told by, I don't know, a worker, or how do they seem to be told or mandated to come in?
Yep. So I think it's a fairly similar process across most agencies, but I can't speak to all of them.
Mhm.
But the agencies I've worked at, there is always a pre-assessment done.
Okay.
And that pre-assessment, it's quite comprehensive. It can go for roughly an hour and a half to 2 hours. So sometimes you do an hour, you'll have a bit of a break, and then you'll come
Right.
back for the second hour.
Yeah.
And it's getting all your basic demographic type of information. But then it starts delving into what's actually brought you here in the courts. Yes, okay, but what was the behaviour that led to the intervention order, that led to the court date, that led to you being mandated to come? And again, this is relatively universal, is that most men, during the assessment, will have a level of denial, justification, minimizing of their actions. So the classic example I often use is early on in the work, one of the men said to me, my partner and I had a tiff. I'm like, okay, fair enough. And you can kind of just take that at face value and then keep going. But you learn fairly soon that you need to do a bit more exploration. So you have some leading but non-judgmental questions of, well, what did that actually look like? And what did you say? What did she say? What were the actions that followed that? And it transpired after about a solid 10 minutes of going a bit deeper and deeper and deeper, that he had grabbed her head and smashed it so hard against a wall during an argument that it left an indent in the plaster.
Wow.
And that's what he initially had described as a tiff. So those pre-assessments really try and gauge not necessarily a man's recognition or even understanding, but does he have the capacity to understand his actions and take ownership for them? Where is that level? And you'll try and identify some goals as well. So you'll try and get 2 or 3 goals and put a bit of a safety plan in place. And this is all done in that pre-assessment. But really trying to shift the conversation away from, well, if she hadn't done X and the police mistakenly identified me as the respondent or perpetrator, and the magistrates were against me, and child protection doesn't understand. So trying to shift that narrative back to, what was your behaviour? What were your choices? To start that process of understanding that he has a choice in how he behaves and he needs to own that. At the end of the assessment, you identify whether you think the person is group ready. There are some occasions where you might say, no, this person is so rigid in their narrative of what's happened to them and has such a strong victim stance that they would benefit from some, say, one-on-one sessions first, and then be reassessed as to whether they're eligible for the group. But it is done well and done properly. It's a rigorous process to really identify the stage of change that they're at and whether they're capable and have a desire to want to make change.
Have you ever had a participant who appears to be involved in wanting to, engage once they get on board that this is part of how, they're going to have to get through this situation if there's an IVO and there's a required band-aid attendance? When they show they're ready, but then actually as it progresses through the process, they aren't, or maybe they're using the time for grandstanding, or they may be wanting to use it for a way to learn other techniques. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like there's a challenge in the beginning of that buy-in to get them to say, this is important for me to do if I want to become a better dad or a better partner or a better man or a person of society. You know, I can't see clearly how to do that, but I'm being told this is the way will get me through it.
Mm.
So in that mandate of doing it, I mean, how many would you say successfully come out the other side of the program that have learnt or changed or even a small shift?
It sounds like you've been sitting in some of the groups. I ask that question.
Not at all, actually. I've actually
I know.
not at all. But yeah.
So yes, you will get a number of men in the group who are simply there to tick the boxes, even though within the pre-assessment they may have indicated that they're ready and willing to make a change, that they're there to be able to say, I've done what the court has ordered me and I'm out. It's such a fascinating arena to be in. So some of the men, you will generally face resistance to varying degrees from almost all the participants in the group. Around, let's say, in roughly a 16 to 20 week program, which is what most seem to be at the moment, around the 6, 7, 8 week mark, for some of them you can start seeing the penny drop.
Okay.
Now, that occurs when you can establish a good engagement between the facilitators and the participants. And that's a tricky dance because you have to avoid any sense of collusion. You are trying to hold them to account. You are often frequently challenging some of their preconceived notions, their values, their beliefs. You're asking them to challenge it. So to maintain that level of trust and engagement, you have to have a sense of, I suppose, positive regard for them as people, irrespective of the fact that some of them have perpetrated quite heinous acts of abuse and violence. Positive regard for their ability to change as well. And for a lot of men, if you can establish that level, that very non-judgmental approach and a level of trust, as I say, around the 6, 7, 8 week mark, their language starts changing, and small things, they will start using their current or ex-partner's name within the group instead of she or the missus. And I have to tell you one of my favorite stories where we thought we weren't hitting the mark. So at the time we were running the Duluth method of facilitation, the Duluth model, and that involves little video vignettes of a reenactment of an actual incident of abuse that a woman in AFM has experienced, a victim survivor, and they reenact it. And we showed this 2 or 3 minute clip, and one of the men in the group, one of those who had been quite resistant the whole way along, was having a go at the victim survivor. Yeah, but she let him talk to her that way, so she's partly responsible for it, and it's not all his fault, and going down that sort of narrative. There was another he was probably in his 50s. There was a younger member in the group who's around the 26th. He always turned up in activewear as if he just stepped out of the gym. He'd do, the sitting in the chair with the hands back, that very kind of relaxed sort of manner. And he would contribute when we directly asked him, but he wasn't one of those who contributed all that much easily. And so he was sitting in this group, and as I say, this other participant was having a go at the victim survivor in the video. And this relatively young kid, it's all relative given our own age, turned around and said to him, "Listen, mate, until you see yourself in that video, you're going to walk out of here exactly the same as when you walked
Oh,
in.
wow. Yeah.
And that, as a facilitator,
Yeah.
is pure gold.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
it's coming from another participant, not
Yeah.
from the facilitator.
Yeah.
Except for the fact that it was completely inappropriate. I just wanted to run up, grab him, kiss him on both cheeks, and go, yes, you get it. You've sat there for 8 weeks virtually saying nothing, but you actually get it.
Yeah.
Yes. So as I say, there's always the resistance you're going to come up against. But when you get the group dynamics happening well and you can avoid men colluding with each other within the group, but actually you'll get some, you also have rolling groups or closed groups. So the idea with the rolling groups is that, one of the ideas is that men who come in later can be better supported by men who've got more of an idea, and where they can be pulled up and challenged a bit by other members in the group. So when that works, it's an absolute treat.
Okay. How long does the program go for?
So it varies. When I started, I think we were doing about 12 weeks.
Okay.
And now they're up to 20 weeks. Okay. But it can vary depending on the individual organisation. Mm-hmm. As I say, when I began, we used a very psychoeducation model in interacting with the participants. So it would be, we would give them time and space to talk about something that may have happened in their week, preferably a win where they thought about what we'd said and they'd implemented strategies. But often it could be about, yeah, well, she did this and I reacted like that. So you'll unpack that a bit, again, with input from other participants. And then part of the group would be around a theme. So whether it was looking at the costs and benefits of abuse, or body signs, or your family of origin. And something like the family of origin, it sounds so simple, but for some of the men, you can literally see that penny drop or that light bulb moment where they go, oh, wow, I'm just like my dad, and I swore I never would be.
Yeah, yeah.
When you actually talk to them about how you parented, what was the relationship like? And you do it through things like visual aids, etc. You're not necessarily asking them directly. But that they will say in the group, I never realized I was acting just the way that he did, and I never wanted to. So yeah, so that's going around the sort of psychoeducational. But then I've also been in programs where we go more along the Duluth method, which has a very feminist lens inherent in it, and it's looking at a man's actions, intentions, beliefs, and the impact and effects that would likely have on his partner, ex-partner, children, other people around him. And we'll look at a control wheel. So what does control look like in a number of different areas? And then what does equality look like in a number of different areas? So it's the flip side. So in its kind of purest form, you do a week on what does, say, a respectful relationship look like. The following week you do what does intimidation look like, being the converse of respect. And then the final week you'd say, right, how do you move from intimidation to a respectful relationship? And just constantly putting it back to them. So what were the actions? Well, what was your intention when you snatched the car keys off her? Well, I didn't want her to go out. Okay. So what's the belief that underscores that if you don't want her to go out? So again, you're trying to do it without putting a judgment on it, but get him to the point of going or thinking about, what I want is more important than what she might want. And that's the kind of belief that underpins that, the intention and the action. And okay, so what might the impact on her be when you behave that way? So
and that, I mean, I guess that would make it so much harder too, that when they're not ready to open up or to address those challenges or to feel that in a group, they could be judged for being honest, that then those additional layers around their identity and feeling they have agency in the group and can learn from these kinds of opportunities. It's just, it's like, you know, beating your head against a wall if they're not there for that, because there'll be so many other multiple layers related to their engagement.
Yeah, all of that is definitely true. And my experience is that the Duluth model certainly has more of a narrative approach. And I think for some men that probably doesn't work as well. So I personally, I like to use a combination of both those psychoeducation, but kind of with the Duluth model running in the back of it. So you need to be fairly creative. Obviously, you've got to run along the lines that the agency supports and that you're directed. But you can be a bit creative with that as well and bring in other elements. And it's interesting what you say, Melissa, about opening up and being honest. So one of the men in the group, one of the few men actually that I've come across who really, from the first moment he walked in there, was really on board with taking responsibility for his actions and never once blamed his ex-partner and just said, what I did was really dumb. It had nothing to do with her. This is completely on me. And again, you're kind of going, oh, yes, great, somebody gets it. And then he came up and completed what activity we have called a timeline, where you look at what the incident was and then you go back to the beginning to see how did it get lead up to that being such a choice of using abuse.
Right.
And at the end of it, I said to him, that you were really open and honest and incredibly vulnerable with what you shared with us. He took such umbrage at the use of the word vulnerable.
Wow.
What do you mean I'm vulnerable? What are you talking about? That's just, I've got nothing to do with vulnerability. That's just absolute bullshit. And it caught me off guard completely.
Wow.
And what it did do, which was great, was it led us to a discussion within the group of what does vulnerability mean? And why can it produce such a visceral, almost shaming element into a person's reaction? And at the end of it, it became very apparent that it shows you the power of language as well. They associated vulnerability with being weak. So to them, to say they were being vulnerable was showing a weakness. And most of them have been socialized that is not what a man does.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's hard. That's a space for further discussions around, well, how does society set that up? How does community encourage that? Are there certain, I don't know, certain groups within community that is their, framework or their mode of operatus, that vulnerability is considered a weakness and not a strength, or that there is importance in showing vulnerability?
And vulnerability is all about creating connection. It's being able to show that empathy and compassion for someone else because you can connect on that level, even if you haven't had the same experience. But they just saw it as being weak, and that's the last thing they want to display.
Wow.
Yeah. So it is. That's why I say, it's endlessly fascinating. And I think you asked previously, how many men in the group do you see a change with? And it's hard to say. So there was one study done. It could have been by Kathy Humphries, but don't quote me on that. Where I think they looked at maybe a 65% change rate. Which sounds great, and hopefully if that's correct, it is great. But I think the only way you can really manage what change has occurred is by your partner contact.
Mm. Mhm.
because virtually every participant again will say, yep, thank you so much, I've changed, I've learned, etc. But that doesn't often translate to the partner's experience.
Mm. Mm.
And there are times when what's been learnt in the group can be misused, and used as another tactic of power and
Mm.
control over
Mm.
their partner when they get home.
Mm.
So the partner contact is crucial, and the ex-partner contact, if an ex-partner is willing, can be crucial as well, because there are some men in the group who will still be stalking their ex-partners
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so the aim, what is the aim of the outcome of the program? What is the, as you said at the beginning, you talked through some goals independently with each of the participants, but is the objective of the program to get change, or is there other also smaller or significant kinds of objectives that are like learning outcomes from doing the program?
Look, I think at the end of the day, pretty much for anybody who's working in the sector, the aim is to keep largely women and children safer, to keep everyone safer.
Mm.
And with that comment, when I say everyone safe, we can't deny the fact that men experience abuse as well. And I really do believe that services for them are far too sparse, that they need a lot more support if
Yeah.
they're experiencing abuse. And we talk about societal implications, and the shame that would go with a man who might admit to experiencing abuse. But having said that, at the end of the day, for me, it's about keeping women and children safer by having an impact on raising a man's awareness about his behaviour, about the impact it has, about the choices that he's making. And I do believe these are choices. And supporting him to understand that and make changes in his behaviour. Now, some of them in the group, as we spoke about before, are there as a tick box exercise, have no intention of changing, don't believe they need to change because there's nothing wrong with their behaviour, it's everybody else. But for a lot of the men in the group, they leave at least thinking about what could they do differently.
Okay. Yeah.
And, you know, when they talk about operating in a certain way, we can be asking them, again, without the judgment, well, how did that work for you in your last relationship?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, no, she walked out. Okay, so can you see anything within the way you were behaving that was problematic, or where she didn't feel safe, or where she felt scared or threatened, or like she didn't have a choice, etc.?
So I guess it couldn't be obvious to answering this question, but I'd like to hear your insight. Why do you feel, or why do you think this work is valuable? Because you wouldn't be engaged in otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think it ties a bit into the objectives and the aims as well, but it's to really try and affect the change in a perpetrator's behaviour to make other people safer. So, yeah, I really do try and go into the groups having that positive regard for the participants. And if I can support them to raise their awareness and to really be willing, so you've got to provide a very safe space for them to even be willing to say, okay, maybe I could have done things differently. Maybe I had another choice. So to be able to provide that space where they can start, and none of this is going to happen overnight. A lot of these behaviors and values and beliefs have been ingrained and deeply ingrained for a very long time. So it's important to support them to be the best version of themselves they can, to have productive relationships, to be the father they want to be, and to have that relationship with their children that's not based on fear. I think that's incredibly important work. Yeah.
Do you feel some of the participants are not able to do that, or that no matter how you reframe the approach, that they still just don't get it?
Yeah, certainly some of them just don't get it. Yeah, but I hold the hope that after 20 weeks, some of them, and I suppose you can't help but have almost a level of your own expectation of what you'd like to see happen. But even if somebody is not reaching the bar that you have set, it doesn't mean that some change isn't happening. So we had one participant who somebody had double parked in the road in front of him. He was behind and he couldn't get through. And he said, you know what? Previously, I would have just got out and thumped them. And this time I just got out of my car and swore at them and then got back in the car and waited for them to move. And you've got to go, okay, that's a win.
Yeah.
At least we stopped somebody getting thumped. So that's something.
Good point. Yeah.
Yeah. So
good point.
I suppose it's about trying to match our expectations as well. So you can have, on average, you might have, say, 14 to 16 men in the group, but there are times when I've worked with groups that are larger than that as well. So, you've got to try and understand what is a participant's level of engagement, what is their desire to change, what is their capacity to take ownership of their actions. And you've got to do that across, say, 16 men in a group who are all coming into the group with their own days that have happened behind them. So you never quite know what mood they're coming into.
Yeah, true. With. Yeah.
And then they're bringing things into the group that might completely change the nature and the flavor of what you were intending to do, or somebody might make a comment. And as a facilitator, that's a whole nother ball game, is being the only female in the room.
Right. So, okay.
Yeah, but as a facilitator, you've got to be able to say, you know what, that comment makes me feel really uncomfortable. Yeah. I think that's showing a real sign of disrespect for who you were talking about, or whatever it may be. Yeah. And simply that can then lead into a 30 or 40-minute conversation about what does respect look like, and is it the intention behind what you say, or is it people's perception of what you're saying that carries more weight? So you definitely need a level of flexibility. Yeah. And you definitely need to be able to think and respond fairly quickly to what's being brought into the group. Yeah. And I suppose an ability to not necessarily take things on a personal level, or kind of, Bruce Perry talks about when you're, and not that the men in the group are children, I'm not saying that, but when you are dealing with a heightened child, you have to remain as calm as possible. True. To be able to bring them into a more regulated state. Yeah. So some of the comments, some of the behavior, some of the descriptions of the abuse can really heighten you as a facilitator. Yeah. So you need to be able to work on whatever it is that keeps you calm and thinking clearly, because for you to get heightened, when they're getting heightened, it's just going to escalate both people. Yeah. Yeah. So you need to really have I suppose, a good hard look at yourself and understand what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and what you can manage.
So that actually is really good, leads me into my next question about what are the cons of the work you do?
Okay, so I always get this. So the pros are the good things, the cons
That's right.
are okay. What are the cons? I suppose some of the cons are when somebody leaves the group. And again, as I said just before, your own kind of unconscious bias of you would hope that they are affecting some change. And if they leave the group and you think they haven't, that you've just missed the mark, that you haven't managed to connect, that you haven't managed to make their partner, ex-partner, children, parents, whoever, safer, that can be disheartening. It can be confronting, certainly in terms of the level of abuse. It can be triggering based on your own experiences of abuse, either currently or historically, when you were a child or with your parents. So you have to be aware of that. It can be infuriating because sometimes things are so bleedingly obvious to you, and you'll put it to the group and somebody will just be like, not getting it. And you're like, what are you not getting? When you threaten to kill your pregnant wife and 2-year-old child, of course child protection is going to take that seriously when it's reported, and of course the magistrate's going to take it seriously. And they're looking at you like you're a bleeding idiot because obviously I didn't mean it. What are you not getting? I'm kind of going, okay, we're kind of, both missing the point here, I fear, or at least one of us is. So it can be frustrating and it can be disheartening. But for me personally, I hold on to the hope that at least one, as a minimum, but at least one of the participants will walk away and make a choice to change their behaviour in a way that will have a positive impact on their previous relationship or relationships going forward, both with partners and children.
So then the flip side, the pros of the job.
The pros. Look, I think a lot of us get into this work because we are fascinated by the human condition. And for me, never more so than being in a men's behaviour change group. And really, I suppose, also bringing in, trying to bring in a very trauma-informed lens to be looking at each participant and not thinking what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. What's happened in your life that you believe that you need to be the one in charge of every decision, and you have to demean your partner in front of the children to maintain that position. Where is this coming from? And if you can try and unpack that with a participant, and again, this is the beauty of a group, and when a group works well, if you can unpack that with one person, it will generally resonate with at least some of the other men in the group as well. They'll go, oh yeah, well I feel the same, and that's that's similar to my story or my condition. So yeah, there is a lot of gratification in seeing, like this young man I described before, who kind of hadn't said much but actually got it. But until you start seeing your behaviour the same as other people's behaviour who are abusive, and we had one man in the group who was elderly. He was well into his 70s, and at the end of the group, so whether it's a closed or a rolling group, when they finish their sessions, we ask each of them to get up and have a few minutes to talk about what did you find useful, what will you take away, etc. And this man, his wife was still with him after, you know, maybe close on 60 years of marriage. But by his own description, he had treated her horrendously. And he got up and he said, and there were younger men in the group from early 20s up to their sort of 50s and 60s, a whole range of ages. And he got up in the group and said, listen, guys, I'm here to tell you, you're young enough not to make the same mistakes that I have. My kids don't talk to me. I've never seen my grandkids. I'm at the point of thanking God every day that my partner's still with me, because I'm buggered if I know why. Make the change now.
Wow.
Don't wait till you're at this end of life where the end is fast approaching.
Yeah.
And you have all these regrets about your behavior and your relationships. Make the change now.
Wow.
And you just can't go.
Yeah.
And honestly, there was virtually not a dry eye in the house.
No
We all
doubt. Yeah.
teared up. And it was so impactful and so emotional and vulnerable again, where he was really trying to impart on these 15 other participants, do it differently. It's too late for me, which we're kind of trying to say it's not, but okay.
Yeah.
It's too late for me now. It's not for you. So that's, you know, and those sort of things sustain you and they stay with you. And you take it into the rest of the work that you do. So something like that is a real pro for me.
Yeah. So coming up to our last question, any suggestions or advice you have for those who are watching this webinar in doing the work, anything that you could pass on as words of wisdom or suggestions if they were thinking of coming into this kind of work?
Yeah, I'm not so sure about the words of wisdom bit, but
you've passed on some actually in this, so you know.
Yeah, I would say it's really, oh goodness, where do I start? So many things. Okay, so initially, if this was something that you were interested in, observe as many different groups as you can. So I'm not sure what the current regulations are. I know observing groups is built into the course, that so all agencies will allow observers if you're undertaking the course, because it's just, that's how you get more facilitators in the arena. I don't know if they will allow people to observe simply because you work in the sector, but there's Peninsula Health, Star Health, Family Life, LifeWorks, Relationships Australia. They all run programs. Pick up a phone, ask them. And I would observe as many groups as you can with different facilitators, because each facilitator brings their own unique style. And there are some things where you go, oh goodness, I would never do that. And there's other things where you go, oh yeah, that I get what you're saying. I'm going to use that. That's terrific. And that will give you an indication as to whether this is an arena for you to be in or not.
Yeah.
And I'd encourage everybody to really put thought into it. It can be really challenging. We all bring our own unconscious biases into it.
Yes.
What are your thoughts about men who are abusive? You know, we all have more of a sort of guttural or visceral reaction to, say, pedophiles, or sex offenders. But these are men who have perpetrated what you could consider to be milder abuse to very extreme forms of abuse. How are you going to manage that? So you need to be thinking about that as well. Once you've decided that, yes, this is an area you think you'd like to pursue, there are a couple of courses. I think both Swinburne and Chisholm offer courses. So it's about enrolling in a course because you need to be accredited. So, and there is a time fraction that you need to allow for that. I'd avail yourself of the opportunity to work with as many different facilitators as possible, because again, when you're co-facilitating, it's quite a unique experience as well. And it's almost like a real dance, but when it works well in the ideal world, between facilitators, where you're not rescuing somebody, they're not rescuing you, but you're working alongside each other. And you will tell when your co-facilitator, when it's appropriate to step in with something, or where you're better off just backing off and being in the background, let them run with something. And the other thing I'd probably advise is, and this is for any worker who's starting out in any area in this sector, don't be too hard on yourself. Mistakes will be made. There is virtually never a group that I walk out of where I don't go, oh my goodness, did I really say that? Or, you know, Jim mentioned X and I didn't pick up on it, and that would have been so valuable for the group. So yeah, cut yourself a bit of slack. Mistakes will be made, and just give yourself time to really learn the dances, learn the ins and outs, become familiar with the nuances, see what works well for you. And that can change as well. You might love a particular approach and then experience something else that works better for you. So yes, I think that probably would be about it in terms of advice.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for participating in our interview. And for those who are watching, we are going to have some more of these with various professionals in their field. So please watch out for them being loaded up on SouthSafe. And I want to thank Bev Lewi for again coming today and answering our questions about a day in the life of an MBC person who's doing facilitation with men's behaviour change programs. So thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for the opportunity. I feel like I've just been to an hour of therapy able to sit and talk about all of this. So thank you. And yeah, good luck to anybody who does want to come into the field. We need really, really good facilitators. So hopefully this will attract some more.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bev. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.